Hi everyone, happy Friday. I hope that all my Friendship Valley friends got to partake in the virtual field day today and had a really great time. So we are about to start chapter 8, which is titled Flight of the Fat Lady. So we're wondering if that refers to the lady that's in the portrait that they have to say the password to in order to get into the Gryffindor dormitories, or if it's somebody else. But when we last left off, the students had just had their first Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson with Professor Lupin. He gained their respect right away with the way that he dealt with Peeves, the poltergeist. Then he had them go to the staff lounge and they had to deal with a Bogart. Most of the students did. Curiously enough, Harry and Hermione did not do that. And so this is how the chapter ended. That was the best Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson we've ever had, wasn't it? Said Ron excitedly as they made their way back to the classroom to get their bags. He seemed like a very good teacher, said Hermione approvingly. But I wish I could have had a turn with the Bogart. What would have been for you, said Ron, snickering. A piece of homework that only got a 9 out of 10? Chilly, is this right in my way? But that's how the chapter ended. Oh, I think Chilly sees something outside, like a bird or a squirrel. So chapter 8 is titled Flight of the Fat Lady. In no time at all, Defense Against the Dark Arts had become most people's favorite class. Only Draco Malfoy and his gang of Slytherins had anything bad to say about Professor Lupin. Look at the state of his robes, Malfoy said in a loud whisper as Professor Lupin passed. He dresses like our old house elf. But no one else cared that Professor Lupin's robes were patched and frayed. His next few lessons were just as interesting as the first. After Bogarts, they studied redcaps, nasty little goblin-like creatures that lurked wherever there had been bloodshed, in the dungeons of castles, in the potholes of deserted battlefields, waiting to bludgeon those who had gotten lost. From redcaps, they moved on to kappas, creepy water dwellers that looked like scaly monkeys with webbed hands itching to strangle unwitting waders in their ponds. Harry only wished he was as happy with some of his other classes. Worst of all was potions. Snape was in a particularly vindictive mood these days, and no one was in any doubt why. The story of the Bogart assuming Snape's shape and the way that Neville had dressed it in his grandmother's clothes had traveled through the school like wildfire. Snape didn't seem to find it funny. His eyes flashed menacingly at the very mention of Professor Lupin's name, and he was bullying Neville more than ever. Harry was growing to dread the hours he spent in Professor Trelawney's stifling tower room, deciphering lopsided shapes and symbols, trying to ignore the way Professor Trelawney's enormous eyes filled with tears every time she looked at him. He couldn't like Professor Trelawney, even though she was treated with respect, bordering on reverence by many of the class. Bavardi Patil and Lavender Brown had taken to haunting Professor Trelawney's tower room at lunchtime and always returned with annoyingly superior looks on their faces as though they knew things the others didn't. They had also started using hushed voices whenever they spoke to Harry, as though he were on his deathbed. Nobody really liked Care of Magical Creatures, which after the action-packed first class, had become extremely dull. Hagrid seemed to have lost his confidence. They were now spending lesson after lesson learning how to look after flubberworms, which had to be some of the most boring creatures in existence. Why would anyone bother looking after them, said Ron, after yet another hour of poking shredded lettuce down the flubberworms' slimy throats. At the start of October, however, Harry had something else to occupy him, something so enjoyable it more than made up for his unsatisfactory classes. The Quidditch season was approaching, and Oliver Wood, captain of the Gryffindor team, called a meeting one Thursday to discuss tactics for their new season. There were 7 people on a Quidditch team, 3 chasers whose job it was to score goals by putting the quaffle, a red soccer-sized ball, through one of the 50-foot-high loops at each end of the field, 2 beaters who were equipped with heavy bats to repel the bludgers, 2 heavy black balls that zoomed around trying to attack the players, a keeper who defended the goalposts, and the seeker who had the hardest job of all, that of catching the golden snitch, a tiny winged walnut-sized ball whose capture ended the game and earned the seeker's team 100 extra points, 150 extra points. Oliver Wood was a burly 17-year-old now in his 7th year and final year at Hogwarts. There was a quiet sort of desperation in his voice as he addressed his 6 fellow team members in the chilly locker rooms on the edge of the darkening Quidditch field. This is our last chance, my last chance, to win the Quidditch Cup, he told them, striding up and down in front of them. I'll be leaving at the end of the year. I'll never get another shot at it. Gryffindor hasn't won for 7 years now. Okay, so we've had the worst luck in the world. Injuries, then the tournament getting called off last year, Wood swallowed, as though the memory still caught a lump in his throat. But we also know we've got the best ruddy team in the school, he said, punching a fist into his other hand, the old magic glint back in his eye. We've got 3 superb chasers, Wood pointed at Alicia Spinnet, Angelina Johnson, and Katie Bell. We've got 2 unbeatable beaters. Stop it, Oliver, you're embarrassing us, said Fred and George Weasley together, pretending to blush. And we've got a seeker who has never failed to win us a match, Wood rumbled, glaring at Harry with a kind of furious pride. And me, he added as an afterthought. We think you're very good too, Oliver, said George. Spanking good keeper, said Fred. The point is, Wood went on, resuming his pacing, the Quidditch Cup should have had our name on it these last 2 years. Ever since Harry joined the team, I thought the thing was in the bag, but we haven't got it, and this year's the last chance we'll get to finally see our name on the thing. Wood spoke so dejectedly that even Fred and George looked sympathetic. Oliver, this year's our year, said Fred. We'll do it, Oliver, said Angelina. Definitely, said Harry. Full of determination, the team started training sessions, 3 evenings a week. The weather was getting colder and wetter, the nights darker, but no amount of mud, wind, or rain could tarnish Harry's wonderful vision of finally winning the huge silver Quidditch Cup. Harry returned to the Gryffindor common room one evening after training, cold and stiff, but pleased with the way practice had gone, to find the room buzzing excitedly. What's happened? He asked Ron and Hermione, who were sitting in 2 of the best chairs by the fireside and completing some star charts for astronomy. It's the first Hogsmeade weekend, said Ron, pointing at a notice that had appeared on the battered old bulletin board. End of October, Halloween. Excellent, said Fred, who had followed Harry through the portrait hole. I need to visit Zonko's. I'm nearly out of stink pellets. Harry threw himself onto a chair beside Ron, his high spirits ebbing away. Hermione seemed to read his mind. Harry, I'm sure you'll be able to go next time, she said. They're bound to catch Black soon. He's been sighted once already. Black's not fool enough to try anything in Hogsmeade, said Ron. Ask McGonagall if you can go this time, Harry. The next one might not be for ages. Ron, said Hermione. Harry's supposed to stay in school. He can't be the only 3rd year left behind, said Ron. Ask McGonagall. Go on, Harry. Yeah, I think I will, said Harry, making up his mind. Hermione opened her mouth to argue, but at that moment Crookshanks leapt slightly onto her lap. A large dead spider was dangling from his mouth. Does he have to eat that in front of us, said Ron, scowling. Clever Crookshanks, did you catch that all by yourself, said Hermione. Crookshanks slowly chewed up the spider, his yellow eyes fixed insolently on Ron. Just keep him over there, that's all, said Ron irritably, turning back to his star chart. I've got Scabbers asleep in my bag. Harry yawned. He really wanted to go to bed, but he still had his own star chart to complete. He pulled his bag toward him, took out parchment, ink, and quill, and started work. You can copy mine if you'd like, said Ron, labeling his last star with a flourish and shoving the chart toward Harry. Hermione, who disapproved of copying, pursed her lips but didn't say anything. Crookshanks was still staring unblinkingly at Ron, flicking the end of his bushy tail. Then, without warning, he pounced. Oi, Ron roared, seizing his bag as Crookshanks sank 4 sets of claws deeply into it and began tearing ferociously. Get off, you stupid animal. Ron tried to pull the bag away from Crookshanks, but Crookshanks clung on, spitting and slashing. Do you like this part of the story, Chili? Ron, don't hurt him, squealed Hermione. The whole common room was watching. Ron whirled the bag around, Crookshanks still clinging to it, and Scabbers came flying out of the top. Catch that cat, Ron yelled, as Crookshanks freed himself from the remnants of the bag, sprang over the table, and chased after the terrified Scabbers. George Weasley made a lunge for Crookshanks, but missed. Scabbers streaked through 20 pairs of legs and shot beneath an old chest of drawers. Crookshanks skidded to a halt, crouched low on his bandy legs, and started making furious swipes beneath it with his front paws. Ron and Hermione hurried over. Hermione grabbed Crookshanks around the middle and heaved him away. Ron threw himself onto his stomach and with great difficulty pulled Scabbers out by the tail. Look at him, he said furiously to Hermione, dangling Scabbers in front of her. He's skin and bone. You keep that cat away from him. Crookshanks doesn't understand it's wrong, said Hermione, her voice shaking. All cats chase rats, Ron. There's something funny about that animal, said Ron, who was trying to persuade a frantically wiggling Scabbers back into his pocket. It heard me say that Scabbers was in my bag. Oh, what rubbish, said Hermione impatiently. Crookshanks could smell him, Ron. How else do you think? That cat's got it in for Scabbers, said Ron, ignoring the people around him who were starting to giggle. And Scabbers was here first, and he's ill. Ron marched to the common room and out of sight, up the stairs to the boys' dormitories. Ron was still in a bad mood with Hermione the next day. He barely talked to her through herbology, even though he, Harry, and Hermione were working together on the same puffapod. How's Scabbers? Hermione asked timidly as they stripped fat pink pods from the plant and emptied the shining beans into a wooden pail. He's hiding at the bottom of my bed shaking, said Ron angrily, missing the pail and scattering beans over the greenhouse floor. Careful, Weasley, careful, cried Professor Sprout as the beans burst into bloom before their very eyes. They had Transfiguration next. Harry, who had resolved to ask Professor McGonagall after the lesson whether he could go into Hogsmeade with the rest, joined the line outside the class, trying to decide how he was going to argue his case. He was distracted, however, by a disturbance at the front of the line. Lavender Brown seemed to be crying. Parvati had her arm around her and was explaining something to Seamus Finnegan and Dean Thomas, who were looking very serious. What's the matter, Lavender? Said Hermione anxiously as she, Harry, and Ron went to join the group. She got a letter from home this morning, Parvati whispered. It's a rabbit, Binky. He's been killed by a fox. Oh, said Hermione. I'm sorry, Lavender. I should have known, said Lavender tragically. Do you know what day it is? The 16th of October. That thing you're dreading, it will happen on the 16th of October. Remember? She was right. She was right. The whole class was gathered around Lavender now. Seamus shook his head seriously. Hermione hesitated. Then she said, You were dreading Binky being killed by a fox? Well, not necessarily by a fox, said Lavender, looking up at Hermione with streaming eyes, but I was obviously dreading him dying, wasn't I? Oh, said Hermione. She paused again, then. Was Binky an old rabbit? No, sobbed Lavender. He was only a baby. Parvati tightened her arm around Lavender's shoulders. But then, why would you dread him dying? Said Hermione. Parvati glared at her. Well, look at it logically, said Hermione, turning to the rest of the group. I mean, Binky didn't even die today, did he? Lavender just got the news today. Lavender wailed loudly. And she can't have been dreading it because it's come as a real shock. Don't mind Hermione, Lavender, said Ron loudly. She doesn't think other people's pets matter very much. He's just a little bitter. Professor McGonagall opened the classroom door at that moment, which was perhaps lucky. Hermione and Ron were looking daggers at each other, and when they got into class, they seated themselves on the other side of Harry and didn't talk to each other for the whole class. Harry still hadn't decided what he was going to say to Professor McGonagall when the bell rang at the end of the lesson, but it was she who brought up the subject of Hogsmeade first. One moment, please, she called as the class made to leave. As you're all in my house, you should hand Hogsmeade permission forms to me before Halloween. No form, no visiting the village. So, don't forget. Neville put up his hand. Please, Professor, I think I've lost. Your grandmother sent yours to me directly, Longbottom, said Professor McGonagall. She seemed to think it was safer. Well, that's all. You may leave. Ask her now, Ron hissed at Harry. Oh, but Hermione began. Go for it, Harry, said Ron stubbornly. Harry waited for the rest of the class to disappear, then headed nervously for Professor McGonagall's desk. Yes, Potter? Harry took a deep breath. Professor, my aunt and uncle, forgot to sign my form, he said. Professor McGonagall looked over her square spectacles at him, but didn't say anything. So, do you think it would be all right? I mean, will it be okay if I go to Hogsmeade? Professor McGonagall looked down and began shuffling papers on her desk. I'm afraid not, Potter, she said. You heard what I said. No form, no visiting the village. That's the rule. But, Professor, my aunt and uncle, you know, they're muggles. They don't really understand about about Hogwarts forms and stuff, Harry said while Ron egged him on with vigorous nods. If you said I could go. But I didn't say so, said Professor McGonagall, standing up and piling her papers neatly into a drawer. The form clearly states that the parent or guardian must give permission. She turned to look at him with an odd expression on her face. Was it pity? I'm sorry, Potter, but that's my final word. You'd better hurry or you'll be late for your next lesson. There was nothing to be done. Ron called Professor McGonagall a lot of names that greatly annoyed Hermione. Hermione assumed an all-for-the-best expression that made Ron even angrier. And Harry had to endure everyone in the class talking loudly and happily about what they were going to do first once they got into Hogsmeade. There's always the feast, said Ron in an effort to cheer Harry up. You know, the Halloween feast in the evening. Yeah, said Harry gloomily. Great. The Halloween feast was always good, but it would taste a lot better if he was coming to it after a day in Hogsmeade with everyone else. Nothing anyone said made him feel any better about being left out. Dean Thomas, who was good with a quill, had offered to forge Uncle Vernon's signature on the form, but as Harry had already told Professor McGonagall he hadn't signed it, that was no good. Ron half-heartedly suggested the invisibility cloak, but Hermione stamped on that one, reminding Ron that Dumbledore had told them about the Dementors being able to see through them. Percy had what were possibly the least helpful words of comfort. They make a fuss about Hogsmeade, but I assure you, Harry, it's not all it's cracked up to be, he said seriously. All right, the sweet shop's rather good, and Zonko's joke shop's frankly dangerous, and yes, the Shrieking Shack's always worth a visit, but really, Harry, apart from that, you're not missing anything. And that's where we're going to leave off for today. So I think we can all kind of connect with how Harry might be feeling being left out of being able to go to Hogsmeade. It's not a very fun feeling at all. But sometimes decisions like that are made because that's just the best and safest option. And so I can completely understand why Professor McGonagall wasn't going to sign his permission form. If she really feels like it could be a dangerous thing, then she's doing the right thing. But that's hard to do. All right, so have a happy Friday and have a wonderful weekend. And on Monday, I shall return with the very second half of Chapter 8, Flight of the Fat Lady, who has not yet appeared. So we don't really understand the title of this chapter quite yet. Have a great weekend, and I can't wait to read with you again. Bye, guys.